Hello, we're Group 11 and we'll go over the idea of control in corporate consolidation. I'm Shafat and I'm joined by Jarrel, Aryan, and Ashley, and our team will cover how control has evolved, our regulatory preferences for consolidated control, the negatives of the old control standard, and the comparative analysis between IFRS and the US GAAP. I'll pass it over to Ashley.
The concept of control under Australian accounting standards has evolved significantly, particularly with the shift from AASB 127 to AASB 10. This transition reflects a move from a rules-based, ownership-focused approach to a principle-based model that better captures economic influence. Under AASB 127, control was primarily determined through legal ownership, where an entity was presumed to control an investee if it held more than 50% of voting rights or had the ability to govern financial and operating policies. Potential voting rights were only considered if they were immediately exercisable, and the standard did not formally recognize de facto control, meaning entities could exert significant influence without triggering consolidation requirements. This approach allowed for off-balance sheet structuring, enabling some companies to avoid consolidating certain entities, thereby reducing financial statement transparency. On the other hand, AASB 10 introduced a more comprehensive framework that assesses control based on three key criteria: power over the investee, exposure or rights to variable returns, and the ability to use power to affect those returns. This shift ensures that control assessments reflect the substance of relationships rather than just legal form. Unlike AASB 127, AASB 10 considers potential voting rights regardless of whether they are immediately exercisable and explicitly recognizes de facto control, broadening the scope of consolidation. Additionally, it requires structured entities such as special purpose vehicles to be included in financial statements when control criteria are met, addressing previous loopholes that allowed their exclusion. This change enhances financial reporting integrity by preventing entities from structuring transactions to avoid consolidation, ensuring that financial statements provide a true representation of economic influence. By prioritizing substance over form, AASB 10 improves transparency, investor confidence, and regulatory compliance, aligning Australian standards more closely with international financing reporting practices.
After careful analysis, our group firmly believes ASB 10 represents a more appropriate approach from a regulatory standpoint. A key consideration involved identifying which framework provided a more accurate representation of control in financial consolidation reporting. Under the pre-IFRS standard, ASB 127, control was primarily defined by equity-based ownership, specifically holding more than 50% of voting rights. Although this rule-based approach was straightforward, it obtained significant limitations, such as allowing companies to exploit structural loopholes to keep key entities off their balance sheets. This lack of transparency presented financial risks to stakeholders, investors, and regulators, preventing them from making well-informed decisions. Recognizing these shortcomings, ASB 10 shifts towards a principle-based framework for assessing control using three interrelated criteria: power over the investee and key decision-making activities, exposure to valuable returns from the investee, and the ability to influence variable returns. This broader framework moves beyond legal ownership and ensures companies must consolidate entities to effectively control, regardless of their formal ownership structure, allowing financial statements to better reflect economic reality. From a regulatory perspective, ASB 10 represents three key advantages, including enhanced transparency, as by capturing de facto control, ASB 10 prevents entities from hiding financial risks through off-balance sheet financing arrangements, greater consistency between Australian accounting standards and international IFRS, improving global financial reporting coherence, and reduced regulatory arbitrage, as a principle-based approach prevents manipulation of corporate structures to circumvent consolidation requirements. ASB 10 ensures financial statements better reflect economic reality by strengthening financial integrity and aligning accounting practices with regulatory objectives. By prioritizing transparency and economic substance, ASB 127 upholds trust and accountability essential to financial markets, which Shafat will explain further.
The premise of the pre-2013 AASB 127 required consolidation mainly when a parent held a 50% or greater stake, which would give them a formal right over another entity's financial and operating policies. If AASB 127 was still in use, entities would be able to exploit loopholes in the standard to avoid consolidation by either restructuring their ownership allocation or by incorporating voting rights in a way that don't necessarily have to meet the majority rule threshold. One way is by hiding their off-balance sheet net assets and liabilities. Babcock and Brown, for example, were known to ring-fence their assets in their main operating subsidiary, B&B International, which meant that the note holders who believed were owed a collective debt of 600 million AUD became unaware of the true consolidated leverage and with limited access to the subsidiary's net assets if insolvency were to occur. Under the AASB 127 in 2009, they were able to omit several liabilities and exposures in consolidated financial statements, which inevitably led their group's share price to crash and culminated in the liquidation of the corporation in that same year. While AASB 127 doesn't establish formal recognition of de facto control, investor companies can still implicitly underplay de facto control while avoiding consolidation. One way is by implementing side agreements. Italian dairy conglomerate Parmalat in 2003 exercised this said de facto control over many offshore entities through various fictitious loan participation agreements, rather than investing in explicit majority shareholdings. The group's management effectively directed the acquired entity's financial transactions without formally exceeding the 50% stake requirement. They would do this by disassociating themselves with the offshore companies by selling them to American citizens with Italian surnames, only to repurchase them later. This structure helped them hide 14.3 billion of euros in debt until the scandal finally came to light, in which their debt was actually 8 times what they had claimed, and CEO Callisto Tanzi was retributed with a sentence of up to 18 years for criminal association and fraudulent bankruptcy. AASB 10's comprehensive definition of control includes both legal and de facto control that stipulates a criteria aimed in eliminating exploitative opportunities in order to enforce greater transparency to the acquirer's creditors, NCIs, and other stakeholders.
The concept of control in Australia under AASB 10 corresponds with IFRS 10, which defines control based on 3 key factors, as my colleagues have already explained, being power over the investee, exposure to variable returns, and the ability to influence returns. This qualitative approach allows flexibility in determining control. In contrast, the US generally accepted accounting principles follow a 2-tiered model, the variable interest entity model and the voting rights model introduced under ASC 10. The VIE model, like IFRS 10, assesses control based on financial interest and exposure to returns. However, it only applies if the investee qualifies as a VIE, which is determined by factors such as insufficient equity, lack of substantive voting rights, or lack of obligation to absorb losses. The voting rights model is a simpler approach where control is based on holding more than 50% of voting power. Notwithstanding the many similarities, there are key differences between IFRS 10 and US GAAP ASC 810. Firstly, US GAAP does not consider potential voting rights, such as call options, which could grant control if exercised. Secondly, de facto control, where an entity exerts influence despite not having a majority stake, is recognized under IFRS 10, but not under US GAAP. These differences mean that US GAAP may consolidate fewer entities, leaving investors exposed to off-balance sheet risks, while IFRS 10 may result in more entities being included, potentially inflating a company's balance sheet. Overall, IFRS 10 adopts a flexible, principle-based approach, allowing for a broader assessment of control. US GAAP, in contrast, applies a stricter rule-based approach, which may exclude entities where practical influence exists, but formal control is not recognized. Understanding these differences is crucial for investors assessing financial statements under different accounting standards. This brings us to the conclusion of our presentation.